Bigfoot. That started in 1958 out in Northern California when the loggers were having roads built up into the mountains so they could access the timber, cut them down. And these men would work during the daytime, and then when 5 o'clock or whatever time they got off work rolled around, they would shut the machines off, the bulldozers and trucks and whatever. They'd shut the stuff off, and then they would go back to town and stay in the barracks or motels or wherever they stayed. Well, in the morning when they'd go back out onto the job site, they started finding these great big footprints, big tracks in this, in the road. And they were puzzled by that. So this operator, this Jerry Krug, he made a plaster cast of one of these footprints, and he took it into town to the Humboldt Times newspaper, and they did a story on it. They took pictures and they ran this story, and they said, well, what made these tracks? And Jerry says, well, the guys on the crew, they just call it, the thing with the big foot. So we call him Bigfoot, 2 words. And over the years, it's jammed into one word. It's Bigfoot. Yeah, my name is Doug Waller, and I'm co-founder of the Southeastern Ohio Society for Bigfoot Investigations. And I've been doing the Bigfoot research and investigations. I believe next year will be the 20th year we started, since we started doing this. And we started our group in 2008. And we would hold meetings every month or every other month, I think, at the library in Cambridge, Ohio. The first recollection I have of Bigfoot is back in the 1970s when there was a creature called Momo in Missouri, and the Missouri Monster, and they called it Momo for short. And it made headlines and television, the news stories. And I remember reading about it. Now, the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967, I was still in high school then, and I don't recall when I became aware of that. But I do remember the Momo incidents.
Do you believe Bigfoot exists? Why or why not?
Yes, and not because I've personally seen one, because I haven't yet. I might never, but we have found a lot of evidence, including tracks and broken trees. We've been close enough to one time to actually smell it. We've heard some of the vocalizations. We found hair on a fence from a location that had repeated, not sightings, but tracks found and screams and all sorts of things like that. So I'm very convinced, plus the fact that I've written 6 books now on the subject and talked to, a few hundred witnesses. And these people that I've written about have convinced me that they saw something. They're telling the truth. I've had people cry over the phone when they've talked to me. I've had people, they'll start to shake and their hair stands up on their arms, on the back of their neck. They get goosebumps, reliving what happened.
So what do you think Bigfoot is? An undiscovered species, a spiritual being, or something else?
That's a good question. I don't know. And I've probably changed my opinion a few times, to where I'm thinking, well, it's a flesh and blood animal. It left tracks and it ran up the bank, it slipped, and here's the footprint where it slid, and it, took a dead deer off the highway because they'll eat anything. So I think it's it's flesh and blood. And then I'll read where somebody found tracks going out through a field and they just stop, maybe in the snow. We'll say there's 25 footprints going out across this snow covered field, and then it stops. But, well, where did it go? Did it sprout wings and fly away, or how did it leave? I don't know. I can't answer that. And I would think something that has the capability to do that, if that's what really happened, has to be more than just flesh and blood, or it has to have assistance from something else. And
Do you think Bigfoot is a dangerous creature, or is it just more misunderstood?
I think for the most part, they're not dangerous. However, should you get in between a mother and a child, all bets are off. It'd be like, getting in between a brown bear and her cub, and you wouldn't want to do that. And a lot of people that think they're dangerous because they say, well, Bigfoot threw rocks at us, or Bigfoot growled at us, screamed at us, shook a tree and broke a limb off and threw it. I think that's all intimidation on his part. He wants you to leave. He doesn't want you to come through anymore. He wants you out of there. And so that's how he's trying to scare you away. If he were really violent and wanting to come and get you and kill you, you'd be dead. He would do it.
What are some of the most convincing pieces of evidence that you've seen supporting the existence of?
Well, of course, the Patterson-Gimlin film supposedly is the holy grail of and I believe it's legitimate myself. And I've seen a few other ones that I believed, passed the sniff test. However, there are some obvious hoaxes out there, and sometimes it takes a real trained eye. Don't come right out and think everything you see is Bigfoot, because there's a lot of it that's not, and you can come up with what really took place. But something else that convinced me was reading about, now this was years ago, maybe 20 years ago, before we had the DNA, we're doing DNA now. They would find hair snagged on a tree or a fence, and they would collect a sample of that hair and they would turn it into some college or university. And they said, we would like to know what this hair is from. Okay, so they take it and they compare it to everything they have in their, collection. And I mean everything from aardvark to zebra and everything in between, all the different mammals, the hair, and it doesn't match anything. And you say, well, so what is it? And they say, well, I don't know what it is. I know what it isn't, and it isn't from aardvark to zebra and everything in between. So there's something unknown out there. But until we have a body, dead or alive, to get some hair and compare to, we just know there's something out there, but we don't know what it is. It's not been officially discovered yet.
Have there been any Bigfoot sightings in like the southeastern Ohio region?
Oh yeah, plenty. We have a map over there on the table that has different colored dots on it. And now these are reports that have come to me rather than me going on like BFRO and some of the other databases and taking their information. Those are ones that people have called me and emailed me and gotten a hold of me personally and told me about. And it's not just southeastern, the whole eastern part of the state, clear up from Lake Erie in Ashtabula County, south, clear down into the Ohio River and then curving west. Now, the western part of the state is so flat, when the glaciers came through and they kind of shaved everything off, it's pretty much all crop field over there, soybeans and corn, with very little forested area like it is in the eastern part of the state. So therefore, I believe that's why we get so much more information reports from the eastern part. A lot more places for them to hide. Yeah, I can't understand why some of these skeptics get on some of these Bigfoot websites and forums and stuff. You know, if you don't believe in it, then don't look at it. I wouldn't turn the TV on and keep it on that channel of some program that I didn't believe in or didn't like. So why sit there and waste your time if you don't? But I can say this about skeptics. When I've written these books and talked to all these dozens and dozens and dozens of people, easily half of them that have had sightings were skeptics up until that time when they saw one. And that's why it was such a shock to their system to have this thing, you know, in front of their car or walking underneath their tree stand when they're hunting or whatever happened, you know, if they didn't already believe in it. But when a skeptic would come to one of our events or a conference or something and try to argue, I say, hey, if you don't want to believe, don't believe. You know, that's like putting a conservative and a liberal together. I'm not going to argue with you. You know, you do your thing and I'll do my thing. But just remember, when you're driving down that dark road late at night and something runs down off the bank and goes in front of your car, that's happened lots of times, and there's stories written about that in these books.
Have you ever been involved in these Bigfoot like field investigations or?
Yeah, when when Shauna and I first started doing this, I think it was 2006. Um, I was reading books left and right on Bigfoot, and we were doing internet searches about reports here and there, and we found that there was a sighting that took place the summer of 2004 at Salt Fork in Guernsey County, and we knew the couple that saw the creature. So we contacted them and they agreed to meet with us out at the park and show us where it took place. And it just kind of caught fire. And so every weekend we were out in the field, you know, unless the weather was terrible or something. But we'd go to Coshocton County, which is just west of where we lived. There were a lot of reports from that county. And then we would hit Salt Fork quite a bit. And we did find tracks and broken trees and stuff. And finally started getting reports from other people and, you know, venturing out a little bit, and went online and met a lot of other Bigfoot enthusiasts. And we started our group in 2008, and we had people coming to the meetings. And the reason we started our group was to give eyewitnesses a place to go and be with other people who had also had, you know, encounters and sightings and stuff, and let them talk about what happened without fear of being ridiculed and laughed at. Because that, sadly, that's still what happens today when somebody, yeah. And imagine how tough it was for the people 50 or 60 years ago that saw something. They couldn't go to the library and get on the internet, or they couldn't text their friend, and, you know, they had to in person tell somebody, and most of the time they got laughed at. And not just neighbors, it was friends and family members. And most everybody I know that I've talked with that had a sighting tell me they lost friends and even family members that think they're nuts, and so they had a falling out over this. Some of these people, they can't accept the fact that cousin Leroy saw something and it scared the snot out of him, and they still insist he was, you know, drinking one too many, you know, or in smoking something he shouldn't have been. But and then and people say, well, they can't be true. If they were, people would see them. Well, they do, thousands and thousands of people. But probably the great majority of the people don't come forward and report it just because they don't want to get laughed at.
Right, right. Are there any tools or techniques that you guys use when you're on an investigation or anything?
Well, we use the parabolic microphone, and a lot of these people that I know that have deeper pockets than me, they've got night vision and they've got the forward-looking infrared, the FLIR, and I've got a few audio recorders, that I'll put out and listen for screams or, howls or something like that. But you can get a lot of money wrapped up in this stuff, in a quick time.
Equipment still?
Yeah, in cameras and now trail cameras, I don't own any, but there was a guy out of our group. We had a homestead where the couple had Bigfoot activity for years on their property. And we befriended this couple and we would go out there quite a bit and, walk the woods. And this fellow I'm talking about put 3 trail cameras up there, outside of the home. And we thought, boy, we're going to get some really good pictures. We didn't get anything. We got the lady mowing the grass and we got the neighbor's dog from a mile down the road coming by one day, and we got the mailman pulling up and putting letters in the mailbox. We never got any Bigfoot stuff. And then in researching Bigfoot and trail cameras, I kept reading over and over that they're so intelligent, they have a way, for whatever reason, they know those cameras are up, they know what they are, and they avoid them. They can see the infrared, or they can smell something, or I don't know what it is. But the homeowner was glad because the activity dropped way off. The creatures would come and slap on the back of the house, and leave footprints on the porch. We put the cameras up and that all stopped.
Scare them away.
I guess they knew the cameras were there. I talked to a lot of other researchers, some of them that's been doing this a lot longer than me, and there are a few of them. Steve Calls is one who has outed a lot of hoaxers. He's like the Sasquatch detective, because there have been a number of people that have fake stuff, and there's still stuff. I tend to trust what I read in a book that's been published a lot more so than what I trust something I look at on YouTube, because, it's so easy for people to fabricate stuff and put it out there. And, if you're going to go to the trouble to write and publish a book, and you got a lot of money wrapped up in that.
Yeah, you probably believe in it if you want to take the time to write.
Yeah. And it kind of taints everything that's on YouTube to a certain extent. And I'm sure there's a lot of legitimate stuff on there now. But with artificial intelligence, how in the world do you know what's real and what's not real?
What's it like being a part of the Bigfoot community? How do you connect with other researchers?
Well, Facebook is a big, way of doing it. But there's so much arguing on there on Facebook, and a lot of these researchers take themselves way too seriously. And I try to be humble, and people come up and they say, "Oh, you spoke at this thing, and Jeff Meldrum spoke, and Cliff spoke, and Renee and Bobo. You're one of the." No, don't pat me on the back and say superstar. I'm not an expert. Nobody is. It's not about Doug Waller. It's about Bigfoot, and I'm interested in it. And here's what I have to offer: stories of people's sightings. And I think it's important to write these things down and save them, because if that eyewitness dies and takes that story with him, it's lost forever, if it's not recorded. The very first one came out in 2012 or 2013, and it's how we got started and our early investigations. And I got a phone call from the producer of the Finding Bigfoot program, and she said that the whole crew would be coming from out in California to Guernsey County, and they were going to stay in a hotel there in Cambridge, and they're going to be shooting a lot of video out of Salt Fork. And she wanted to know if I had any knowledge of any eyewitnesses. And I said, I sure do. We've got people come to our meetings that have had sightings. So I introduced uh, the eyewitness to, not the crew members, but the lady that contacted me. And then she brought, Bobo and Cliff and Renee and Matt Moneymaker. And, we got to meet all the crew and talk to them. And they actually did an episode, and it aired in 2012, I believe, and it's called Buckeye Bigfoot. And there's a lady on the show that's in our group. Her name is Lorena Cunningham, and she had two different daytime sightings. The first one was 1984, and then she had another one 20 years after that. And then she had a third incident where she didn't actually see one, but it was in the barn at the same time she was in there trying to feed the horses. It was in the hay loft up over top of her. And that's a really scary story. But what's unique about her stories is all three of them took place in the daytime, which was extremely rare. So that's in the first book. And then the rest of them are all like coming to events like this and having people come up and they say, I saw one of those things. And I don't have time, when we do these library talks, because they're like an hour and then tear down and get out because they're going to close. But I get the contact information off the witnesses, and then I'll get a hold of them later, talk to them over the phone or in person, and I'll record the conversation and I'll take notes, and I say, I may want to use your story in my next book. And if I do, would you like to have your name used, or would you rather I didn't? And most of them say, yeah, you can use my name. But I get some every now and then. I've had lawyers and teachers, and professionals, and they said, no, you better not use my name. So that's fine. I just want the story, because, if you're gone and that story is not written down somewhere, then it's lost. And it's history, it's stuff that really, really happens.
Well, that's cool. So it's like events like this are where you get the content
Yeah,
books.
yeah. And sometimes, we'll ask the audience if anyone here has had an incident that they want to talk about. Occasionally you get some brave soul that'll raise their hand and they'll talk about it, but a lot of times they don't say anything, and they'll come up later on when we're tearing down and packing away, and then they'll say, I saw one of those. And I've had people shaken because, they're reliving it when they start telling you about it.
Wow. So this thing really.
And there, and there's a lot of stories still out there. And I've taken stories from old farmers, and they predated the Patterson-Gimlin film from 1967. And, the guy was like 10 years old when he saw one, and it was in the late 50s or early 60s. And say, well, did you tell anyone? He said, who would I tell? They wouldn't have believed a kid.
Yeah.
And, he just held it in all that time. Well, there's one that I didn't go to I did meet the guy, but his name was Okie, and he had two different stories. The first one, the stories are in my fifth book, this one here. He and his friend were driving around scouting for deer for the upcoming deer season, and they saw a Bigfoot in this field, and it went into the woods, and they drove down close to where they had seen it and pulled in, and they were looking around, and it come out of the woods close to their car, and it scared them, so they left. Well, then I can't recall right now how long it was, but after that, another, a few weeks or months or maybe a couple years later, this same fellow was out deer hunting with a friend, and the friend got a nice buck. And they were dragging it back because they couldn't get the truck back out in there. They dragged it as far as they could, and they had gutted it out, and they had it down on the ground, and there was an open field there and a great big brush pile, and they put it behind that brush pile, and they said, okay, we'll walk back to the house where the truck was, a four-wheel drive truck, and we can get this far. Well, once they got back to the house, the guy that killed the deer had an emergency phone call, and his father was in the hospital, and he had to leave, and he took the four-wheel drive truck. So the other guy says, don't worry about your deer. I'll walk out there and I'll get it back to the house myself. And when he went back to get it, now this was way late at night because they hunted till almost dark. He went ahead and ate dinner and took a nap because he was going to be doing some hard work. He went back out unarmed. I think I don't even think he took a flashlight because there was a bright enough moon. But he got back to where the brush pile was, half a mile or so from the house, and he heard something back in that brush pile. And he thought, uh-oh, the coyotes must have found that deer and they're eating it. And he hustled up a little bit and went around the corner, and this Bigfoot was down on one knee and lifting that deer up into the chest cavity, and which, all the guts had been removed. And he's like from me to you from it. And it stands up and it screamed at him. And he could feel his heart thumping. And I said, well, obviously he made it out alive. Here he's talking to me. I said, well, what did you do? He says, I screamed back at it. And it got a real funny look on his face and dropped the deer, and it stomped off. And then it like threw a tantrum and tore up a bunch of trees and pushed them over and broke sticks. And he just stood there. And he said the thing just walked away. And he said, I didn't know what else to do. He said, my feet were frozen. I couldn't. And the craziest thing is, he told me he still deer hunts. I says, no. He says, yeah, but he says, I'm in the house before dark now. He said, I still deer hunt back in that same spot we got that deer. Sasquatch, the name Sasquatch came to be in the 1930s. There was a school teacher named Burns. He was teaching at I believe they were called the Chelis Indian tribe out in British Columbia. And a lot of these indigenous people would tell Mr. Burns about these creatures up in the mountains. And the name they gave them was something like Sasquatch, but it was a little bit different. But that was his interpretation of what they were saying. So the term Sasquatch came to be in the 1930s. I've got some stories in my books about them eating fish. There's a story in one of these about a guy fly fishing out in, I think it was Idaho, and there was a bend in the river, and he was wading out. He had hip boots or waders on. He's wading out in water, and he caught a big, I think it was a whitefish, and it went downstream around this bend, and he had to go after it because he thought it was going to break his line. And when he made the corner on the river himself, over on the other bank, he saw this, what he thought was a black bear that had his fish. It was down on all fours and had his fish eating it. And he's standing there watching it. And all of a sudden, the black bear looks up, and he said it didn't have a bear's face at all. It had more of a monkey face or a caveman face. And he said it stood up and had that fish in its hands. He said it didn't have paws like a bear, it had hands. And I think he said it took a bite out of the fish and then spit it out, like showing the fisherman, there, I got your fish, what are you going to do about it? And the guy said he was quite shaken by this. He was there by himself. And he said he said the thing stomped off and he stood there for probably 20 or 30 minutes before he could move and walk out of the water. And I said, did you ever go back? He said, oh yeah. He said, I went back a couple of years later, you know, a few times, but I always had friends with me and when I went back. As a matter of fact, I think they'll eat just about anything. They're omnivorous. They're probably one of the main courses they like to eat. It would be white-tailed deer, at least around here, because we have a lot of them. They'll eat any kind of vegetables. They'll gladly come into your garden, take whatever they want. We've had reports of them going into people's yards and stripping apple trees overnight or pear trees. They've been seen dumpster diving, eating dead animals off the road, breaking into, like if somebody would have a spring house or someplace where they keep meat, they'll break into that and steal it. You know, they're just like great big raccoons. You know, they'll eat whatever they want. Yeah, we were attending a Bigfoot meeting in Newcomerstown, Ohio, back in 2006, I guess, and we met this family. Well, we didn't actually meet him that night, but the fellow that put the meeting on used to pass a paper around everybody was supposed to sign. And I kept looking at this guy, and I thought, I've seen that fellow somewhere. And I figured out from the signatures on there which one was him. And it turned out he was from the Cambridge area, and he would write a column like once a month or so. And so I tracked him down, called him up, and I said, I was at that meeting last Saturday night, and you were there. And he said, okay, I remember seeing you back here. Well, come to find out, he lived in rural Guernsey County out in Knox Township, and he's claimed to have Bigfoot out around his property. And I'm using the term Bigfoot as a plural. You know, we don't typically say Bigfoots or big feet. It's like deer. You could be one deer, it could be 9 deer. In this case, Bigfoot's meaning there's a family group or whatever out on the property. And they incidentally didn't live very far from Salt Fork, maybe 6 miles as the crow flies. So we went out, we were invited out to the house, and my wife and I at the time went out and met Mr. and Mrs. Rayner and went in and had, we had, I don't know, some dessert. Don Rayner had this is actually, I don't think this is the original, I think this is a copy, but he called it his Bigfoot Diary. And I'll read some of the entries off of here. It says, October of '85, they moved to the country. Now, they used to live out in the country, then they moved to Columbus for a while. October of '85, they were back. Okay, January of 1989, ML, that's for Mary Lou. ML saw footprints in the snow behind the wagon shed. Summer of '92, night after night, screams in the woods north of house. Winter of '93, '94, very cold winter. Cattle afraid to go into the barn. This thing where the cattle being afraid to go into the barn happened more than one time out there. And what happened was, you know, in the wintertime, there's nothing growing out in the pasture, so you got to feed your animals. So they would go out, one or the other of the ringers would go out into the barn every morning and feed the cows. Well, they always had Black Angus cattle out there, 6 or 8 head. And they told me what took place was there were a couple of these instances and they were similar. The cows would stand out in the pasture, you know, in January. And so they'd say, well, let's go out and feed the cows. So they'd go out and get the hay and start putting it in the stalls. and the cows would not come into the barn. They'd just stand out there in the pasture. And, you know, Don or Mary Lou are thinking, well, what's the matter with them? You know, that they should be hungry because they haven't eaten anything all day, all night. And they would continue to put the hay down, and when they would walk back to the house, then they would look down and see these great big footprints where there was a set of them going into the barn, where supposedly the thing went into the barn at some point during the night to get in out of the cold. And then in the early morning, it left a set of tracks coming out. But those cows would not go in. They'd stand out there in the field and bawl, and they wouldn't go in to be fed. And I don't know if it was because they had seen what was in there or they smelled it, but they knew something had been in there. And that happened more than once. Summer of '94, heard tremendous scream in the woods south of house one evening. And then down here, they would hear wood on wood, like somebody taking a ball bat and hitting a tree. They'd hear one wood on wood, and then they'd hear another one far off, like somebody was signaling. Screams down in the woods behind the house, and then something slapping the back of the house. You know, all different sorts. Here's one, 7:15:06, 2:10 a.m. Dawn ringer reported hearing a noise that sounded like a combination of an air horn and a train whistle together. A real loud sound. Mary Lou heard knocks on the side of the house. Well, Dawn passed away in January of 2007. And on the very day of his funeral, Mary Lou had, you know, a long, busy day for her, and she left the house with her brother, who had been staying with her. Dawn had been sick for quite a while. I think he had cancer, but they had a wheelchair ramp made at the back door, and she would she would take him to the doctor quite a bit. And on the day of his funeral, you know, she went into town for the funeral, and then they had something at the church, and she stayed with somebody in town, but they were gone most of the day. They got home right before dark, and there's these great big footprints, and it's the ones that Sean has up on the picture. And they were about 19.5 to 20 inches long. The tracks were, and I got pictures. Now, the only thing I didn't do, and I say it was a rookie mistake, I did take a tape measure with me, and I measured the footprints and then how far it was from one footprint to the next. But I should have left the tape measure down on the ground when I took the picture. So if any of you should ever find tracks, try to do that. And if push comes to shove and you don't have a tape measure, you can put a dollar bill down. Some of you, you know, might have had better jobs than what I did. I had to use a $1 bill, but a 5 or a 10 or a 20, they're all about the same. They're 6 inches long. So, and we have done that ourselves when we would go out squatching, as we call it, salt fork. So Dawn passed away in January of '07. Mary Lou continued to live there on her own. And she's 80 years old, living out in the boondocks. There was not another house within sight of her residence. There was another neighbor down over the hill, but it was probably a quarter mile away or so. You couldn't see the house, you know, their house